This segment will continue our discussion of ethical models that comprise collectively the fifth component of leadership. And the focus of this selection is utilitarian ethics. Utilitarians' aim is twofold. Number one, to maximize utility. Secondly, maximizing the utility for the greatest number of people. The two most important theorists here, philosophers of the 19th century, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Bentham espoused the idea of the greatest happiness principle, what we call the utilitarian calculus. The legal system has a significant amount of influence, or this significantly influenced the legal system, the idea that nature placed human beings under governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, and what we ought to do versus what we shall do. Bentham's calculus really focused on these theoretical concepts of hedons, which is positive things of moral worth, and dolors, which are negative things of ethical worth. Mill sort of expands on this theory and talks about the lower levels of stimuli being pleasure and the higher levels of pleasure being intellectual and moral ideas. Mill's concept, his famous quote, is better be a human being dissatisfied than a pig dissatisfied. Bentham's calculus was more of an attempt to quantify moral value, while Mill focused on the quality between different pleasures. They agreed on the concept that the most ethical course of action is one that brings the greatest amount of good to the greatest number of people. The most difficult question for utilitarians is one of boundaries. Can the greatest good for the greatest number, even though it's discriminatory or illegal or immoral? According to the utilitarians, yes, that can be the case. Who is worthy of inclusion or exclusion? Animals, or even in our current debate, immigrants. The effects on the utilitarian decision really are wide spread these days in the business world, stockholders and stakeholders, as we've talked about, but also consumers. The critiques of utilitarianism sort of on the vein that we just discussed, and that's the idea if it's really focusing on the greatest number in the majority, then what about the minority? And the other major critique is the relativity. There isn't an absolute standard as in Kantian ethics. That relativity can mean that certain things that we think of as absolute moral judgments like murder could be still good for the greater number of people in some cases. And of course, the death penalty is one example. Harvard philosophy professor Michael Sandel, who has a famous course on justice, uses several different examples. Probably the most noteworthy example is the story of the HMS Mignette, which is a ship from the 19th century in England, a very famous court case in England called Queen versus Dudley and Stevens. These folks survived a shipwreck, and the captain, which is Dudley, and his first mate, Stevens, and two other people, one of which was a cabin boy. They were rolling about the ocean on a makeshift raft of some kind, and ultimately one of the four died. Three remaining, two of which were the captain and the first mate, decided that the cabin boy was of lesser importance in the scheme of society, and so they ate him to stay alive. And so the utilitarian calculus versus the Kantian calculus in this case was that murder of the cabin boy for the sake of these two high-ranking officials appropriate? We will discuss this matter a bit in class, but it's a good illustration of the relativity of utilitarianism versus the absolute nature of the Kantian belief in moral duty and moral right and wrong. So, looking at utilitarian ethics from the concept of the five components of leadership, the focus really is primarily, as with Kantian ethics, on goal and context. Where Kantian ethics focused on the goal, the utilitarians focus much more on the context. They place the responsibility on the role of the leader, seen as one of the many stakeholders calculating the greatest good for the greatest number. It may not always be beneficial to the leader, in fact, to make this calculation. The leader may be in the minority or in the company of the greatest number. This forces the leader to have a very high ethical standard and to carefully consider their motivations and reasons when making decisions, because sometimes leaders have to make the decision for the greatest good even though it goes against what they believe in or what they advocate for. So there are many hotly debated political issues, gun control, abortion, that deal with the argument of the utilitarian calculus. And followers have, in this issue, must be willing to know what they need to be as a minority or following the majority. The goal is the most important element of this in this case, from the standpoint of what we call teleontological ethics. It's the reconsideration of the ends or the consequences of actions. And in this case, these actions are based on normative actions, not right and wrong. It depends on the outcome, not like the Kantians. Deontological ethics, which is duty-based, the means, not the end. So context is hugely important, the environmental context here, and it can be relative based on the situation. Still should not give a leader the ability to act unscrupulously. And so cultural norms and values are a very significant component of the utilitarian calculus when it comes to looking about how leaders act within the context ethically. And it's very possible that leaders have to engage both the Kantian and the utilitarian mindsets to effectively lead.